Well, Paul Kengor joins us now by Skype. Karl Marx was born Jewish, converted to Christianity at some point in his life, and then rejected God completely. Why did that happen?
Hi, Pat. It's great to be with you. Yeah, he rejected God when he went to college. Kind of the same old story. He had a professor in college who taught systematic theology who was an atheist. So you can see not much has changed with our universities in 200 years. But and that professor, by the way, was very anti-Semitic. And Karl Marx, who came from a family of rabbis, became very anti-Semitic. And by the way, as I also document in this book, he was an out-and-out racist. And if there's one thing that I really like, I have the memoirs of Patrice Cullors, the founder of Black Lives Matter. She says that they spent a year reading Marx and Lenin and Mao, and she says she's a trained Marxist. I'd like her to know that Marx is a racist, and an out-and-out racist who used the N-word often and in very vulgar ways. But unfortunately, so many young people today that have been educated by our universities, they know none of this dark, nasty side of Karl Marx.
Paul, that beard of his, was that some kind of a satanic priest that was a symbol with his beard?
Yeah, I deal with it very carefully, Pat. I'm very careful about what I can say and what I can't say. I don't want to overstate things, but his poems and his plays, they're chilling. I mean, that line that you quoted, that's from an 1837 poem, and he says, "Thus heaven I forfeited, I know it full well, my soul once true to God is chosen for hell." And I also open up the book with another poem where he says, you see this sword, this blood dark sword, which stabs unerringly within thy soul. The prince of darkness sold it to me. And his poems, his plays, he writes about suicide pacts, pacts with the devil, destruction, despair. And I think this is really chilling, Pat. Two of Marx's daughters committed suicide in suicide pacts with their husbands. They took poison. Marx in his poems writes about suicide pacts and pale maidens who killed themselves by taking poison. By the way, one of the suicide pacts was a son-in-law who was from Cuba. And so in Marx's view, that meant that he had part N-word blood. He was partly Negro, as Marx put it. So Marx called him Negrillo, or the gorilla. And this poor guy was so abused and so insulted by Marx and Engels, he eventually took his own life in a suicide pact with Marx's daughter.
Paul, there's something called socialist, and we're running one political party in America that is embracing socialism. One of the big candidates who dropped out was an avowed socialist. As a matter of fact, he went to Moscow on his honeymoon. What is the difference between the socialists and the communists, according to Marx?
Great question. Thank you for asking that. Yeah, according to Marx and Engels, according to Lenin, Marxist-Leninist theory, Marx said that socialism is the final transitionary step to full communism. So a friend of mine says, when he's asked the difference between a socialist and a communist, he says, well, as Christians go to heaven, a socialist goes to communism. Right? I mean, that's what they aspire to. That's their utopia, their new Jerusalem. And it's funny, Pat, because as you know, they're atheists, right? Karl Marx said religion is not only the opiate of the masses, but the heart of heartless conditions, the soul of a soulless world, the sigh of the oppressed creature. He said communism begins where atheism begins. Lenin said, all worship of a divinity is a necrophilia. There's nothing more abominable than God. And yet they treated communism like a faith. In fact, I quote a letter between Engels and Marx where Engels says to Marx, he's talking about the draft of the Communist Manifesto. And he says, Karl, give a little more attention, if you would, to our communist confession of faith. I think we should drop the catechetical form and simply call it the manifesto. So they use this kind of religious language. There's a lot of kind of chilling aping of God throughout Marx's writings, throughout Marx and Engels, and throughout communism. And again, our young people don't understand this. They don't understand that socialism is supposed to lead to communism.
Have you found any reason why this thing spread so fast? I mean, we're talking about 100, 120 million people who've been killed because of Marxism. Why has it spread so fast?
Yeah, it was never spread democratically. In fact, the Bolsheviks took over in the Soviet Union, what would be the Soviet Union in 1917, Bolshevik Russia, and they used force. They used force in gulags. And, Pat, young people, I'll speak around the country on topics like why communism is bad. And they'll come up to me and they'll say, well, I hear the Communist Manifesto is a pretty good book if you just read it. And I'll say, why don't you read it and then come back and tell me that? There's a line in there. The entire communist program may be summed up in the single sentence, abolition of private property. And as soon as you hear that, I mean, you talk about going against biblical law, natural law, God's commandments, the Old Testament, the New Testament. If you try to abolish private property, you're going to have to kill 100 million people. Well, and which is why it's a mystery that would ever spread that fast. I think the answer is not a rational one. I think the answer here is a spiritual one.
They wanted also to reallocate people, and they forced the people from the cities into the countryside. Mao Zedong did exactly that in China.
Yeah, and Pol Pot in Cambodia, the beginning of the movie The Killing Fields, when the people are walking out of the capital, Phnom Penh, going out into the countryside. And Pat, that's actually point 6 in the 10-point plan of the Communist Manifesto, where Marx and Engels write about a more equitable distribution of the population across the countryside. It's right out of the book. They wanted to not only redistribute your property, they wanted to redistribute you. So it wasn't enough to take your stuff and take your churches, but to spread people more equitably around the population of the countryside. And by the way, speaking of the churches, the longest part of this book is not my part on my section on Marx. That's maybe around 120 pages, but the part on the infiltration of churches. And I really want this audience in particular to see how communists in the United States targeted the mainline denominations. They really went after the Episcopal Church, Presbyterian Church USA, and the United Methodist Church. And I quote Earl Browder, one of the leading heads of Communist Party USA, speaking at Union Theological Seminary in 1935. He said to these guys, "You may be surprised to know that we have preachers active in the churches who are actual members of Communist Party USA, actual members of Communist Party USA."
Well, actually, in Russia, Archbishop Nikodem was a dedicated communist, wasn't it? He was in charge of the Russian Orthodox Church. Am I right in that?
The Russian Orthodox Church was so co-opted by the Soviet government that they were forced to comply. And in fact, they really became, I want to be careful how I say this because there are so many good people in the Russian Orthodox Church who resisted this. But they eventually came to a point almost of accommodation where I guess they felt that in order to survive and hold any services whatsoever, even with official KGB church watchers sitting in the pews, that they had to simply accommodate and get along.